Hello and welcome to the Sprint 97 ManageIQ review. Um, Getting close to 100 here. Um, so this was a regular 2-week sprint. And next slide, please. I will provide the overview. Carol will update us on the community. Harpreet will give us an update on the UI. Adam will give us an update on the providers. Ina on Automate. Gregg T on platform. Alberto on the REST API, and Chris on documentation. Next slide. All right. So this sprint we had 301 pull requests merged. Uh, what we're looking at here is the spread out over the top repositories. So the classic UI and the core and the integration tests accounted for, looks like 2/3 of the pie there. B2V coming in fourth, documentation fifth. So I would say that's actually as expected. So next slide, please. Okay. And so this graph here shows us the number of pull requests merged as well as created in the sprint. So we had 301 pull requests merged. So that's 150 a week. Pretty good clip. About 30 per business day. As well as 328 open, which is more than 30 per business day. So still at a good clip. It's a little bit of a drop, but looks like it's even with around the sprint of September 10th. And I think, as we can see, in both places, when we cut a release, some of our resources go to work on that, and I think that may be accounting for the slight drop. Next slide, please. All right, this is the distribution of the merged pull requests. So bugs are 26%, enhancements 22%, documentation 19%. On the others, tech debt and test account for the other stuff. As we kind of get closer to releasing Hammer, I'm expecting the bug count to go up a little bit more than the enhancement count before we focus on the Ivanchuk release. Next slide, please. In terms of the health of the various repositories, the classic UI team is making inroads there. I see they're tackling a bunch of debt there in terms of smells and duplication and other issues. So they're making really good headway there. Some things that we've seem to be going in the wrong direction on are Lenovo. So maybe Adam, you can work with them to take a look why. The other repos seem to be essentially unchanged. Next slide, please. All right, and over to Carol.
All right, thanks, Oleg. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Yes, great. Sorry, because I'm at the Open Source Summit and it's a bit noisy here, so sorry for any background noise. For the community update, we have the beta release of ManageIQ Hammer. So please check it out. First pre-release available for the Hammer release. So and yeah, the blog post that we have is the last month in ManageIQ, which is about building a blog post. So take a look at it.
Cool.
Take a look at the blog post about building blog posts. And then we have a bunch of events coming up in November. First one is Open Source Design Summit in Tirana, Albania. And Teresa and David will be speaking about component-based design system and development. I think it's similar to a presentation they did in Brno last month at a meetup for design systems. So that's that. And then a couple of events with ManageIQ demos. One is OpenStack Summit in Berlin, and one is Build Stuff in Vilnius, Lithuania. It's the same week, but I'll be at one and David will be at the other one with ManageIQ demos. And
Awesome.
well, that's it from me. Thanks. And next slide, please.
Hi all. So for the UI repos, total of 75 PRs were merged. Out of that, 20 were bug fixes, 7 enhancements, 2 refactorings, 29 were tech debt as noticed on the health report, and so on. As for the bug fixes, I have few of those highlighted here. Bug was fixed on the display notifications in the expanded view. And there was another bug fixed in the same area. Mark all as read and clear all links were missing in the notifications footer, so that got fixed. Then an issue was fixed on add edit provider screen on the credentials tab when a user typed in data and hit enter key. That was sending up incorrect credentials from I think default tab for the validation, so that got fixed. Next, the links to the provider details screen were fixed on monitor alerts list view. These links were hard-coded to point to container provider details screen. With the fix now, they should point to a details screen based upon the type of a provider. Infinite spinner issue was fixed when trying to edit orchestration type service dialogues. Finally, an issue was fixed to prevent an error when pressing a custom button for a data store. Next slide, please. On the enhancement side, changes were made in the custom button editor to allow open URL only for the entities that support remote console URLs. A dashboard view was added for a cloud tenant summary view. Tags were added back on the physical infrastructure topology screen. Then there were some enhancements made in V2V area. Infra mappings now have its own screen. Enhancements was made on each of the tabs for map cluster, map data store, and map networks on infrastructure mapping wizards. So you should now see a message in the source box to indicate that all sources have already been mapped. I think previously that box was empty. And on the migration screen, aggregate cards were made to be clickable. And lastly, VM power warnings were added for OpenStack to mapping plan wizards. I have some screenshots to show for enhancements I just mentioned. So next slide, please. So on this screenshot, you can see open URL checkboxes disabled for a custom button for a data store, and a note has been added under the checkbox to indicate that. Next slide, please. That's the new dashboard view for the cloud tenant. Next slide. That's a screen with the physical infrastructure topology screen that shows tags now. Next slide, please. That's the new screen I just mentioned to show infra mappings on its own page. Next slide, please. So over here, you can see the map compute tab has all source clusters have been mapped message in the source provider data center cluster box. So you should be able to see the same message in the next two steps as well. Next slide, please. So that's the migration plan screen. You can now click on the aggregate cards and you should be able to see the list below the cards. Next slide, please. So here you can see the VM power warnings. So if the user selects start migration immediately, you should be able to see the warning on the schedule step. And on the right, you can see if the user selected, say, migration plans to run later, you should see the message on the results step. That's all I have for the UI. On to Adam.
Thanks, Harpreet. Today I'll cover updates from Overt, OpenStack, and Lenovo. Next slide. So this sprint, OpenStack led with the number of PRs of 8. Overt and VMware were second and third. Next slide. So Overt fixed an issue where trying to attach a floppy to a VM was broken in v4. It was working in v3, but the split between those two API versions always seems to cause some inconsistencies, so they fixed that method there for v4. And they also fixed a host of provisioning issues with post-provisioning customization. So having an ISO have customization on it was broken. Kickstart files weren't working, and Pixie was fixed also. On the OpenStack side, there was a fix for duplicate MIQ group causing sync errors with when trying to sync groups and users between OpenStack and MIQ groups. So if one of the names is already taken, the sync would fail. And so they fixed that by adding a timestamp on a name collision. They also exposed cloud volume types through cloud tenants in support of V2V. And they also enhance error handling for neutron errors. There's a different exception message for neutron errors, and they weren't being handled properly. On the Lenovo side, they added the config pattern subclass for customization scripts, just to get some more specifics about that. As for the duplication, I think what happened was the first PR in a series for Graph Refresh was merged the first day of Sprint 98, and so I think that's probably where most of the duplication came from. So it wasn't actually in this sprint. It was kind of a snapshot of a series of PRs coming for the next sprint.
Gotcha.
That's it. On to Tina for Automate.
Thanks, Adam. Good morning. We had 26 PRs merged this sprint. For V2V, since the conversion host class didn't exist when Fabian started to work on V2V, he implemented an Automate solution to interact with overt hosts. Now that the conversion host class has been implemented, Fabian was able to move that code into the conversion host class. As part of that work, it was necessary to expose the conversion host ext management system to the service model and to allow for the conversion host to be set by Automate. For dialogues, Eric added the ability to deny standalone service template ordering from the API based on a product setting. This change gives users the ability to block direct API calls, enabling only UI API calls. Eric resolved an issue where editing a service dialog based on an orchestration stack encountered an error. DrewU made several changes to allow for the API service template order to call the dynamic methods on submit. Previously, ordering a service from the API did not call into Automate for the dynamic dialogues, which is problematic under certain circumstances. Next slide, please. Retirement can be initiated in a system context called from the scheduler based on the object's retirement date, or in a user context when a user selects retire immediately through the UI. DrewU resolved an issue where retirement in the system context was not set in the proper user. Drew also fixed an issue where the retirement requester was not being set in all cases, and where the orchestration stack object was not properly set up for Automate. We exposed folders to the ENS folder service model for easier access to direct child folders. Our current Ansible Tower service implementation does not supply the necessary extravars to connect to the REST API endpoint. Lucy refactored the existing extravar code and added the necessary extravars for Ansible Tower services to connect to the REST API endpoints. That's it for Automate. Next slide, over to Gregg.
All right, thanks, Tina. On the platform side, we had 22 PRs merged. A couple of enhancements are basically some helper scripts to kind of bridge the gap between, the first one is about tags that are mapped for AWS, being able to duplicate those in the global region from all the remote regions, because you need to have the identical tags to be able to report on them, and those you can't really enter through the UI. So we made a script for that. Libor did that. And then Yuri did a script to allow you to duplicate custom report menus from one group to another group, or all the groups that share the same role. Just a convenience so that users don't have to go and manually configure those for each group. That one's real useful. Some bug fixes. We fixed the bug, undefined method find tag with. This is basically fallout from the support that we added for being able to have tag filters in RBAC as opposed to the ones that you check. But there are certain classes that are not taggable, that when we try and resolve those, because it's basically a generic filter that being applied to the class that you're trying to look at. So just a tiny little tweak, fix that. And then there were a couple of fixes having to do with special characters in passwords that actually are unrelated. One was LJ on provider validation using the REST client, and the other one Nick did for embedded Ansible. And that's it for the platform. I'll turn it over to Alberto.
Thanks, Gregg. For the API, we have one enhancement that came in this sprint, and that's by Jovi. We needed to add option support for sub-collections, and that was for pre-flight requests for cores on sub-collections. So standard options HTTP Word with the API collections ID sub collection. So here showing an example for an API tenant's quotas and the standard access control that are coming back for that. And that's it for the API. Next slide, please.
Hi, on documentation in this sprint, we had 14 PRs merged, 13 of which addressed enhancements and 1 which was about a bug. Among those highlights, Avital added an example Ansible playbook regarding pre and post migration tasks. We've updated the PostgreSQL 9.5 support, added a procedure to reconfigure VMware VMs to add or remove ISOs. We made changes to the authentication directory to implement moving external authentication support from the Apache module modauth curb to modauth GSS API. And additionally, downstream, we have finished the 4.7 beta migration guide. That's it for documentation.
All right. So thanks everyone for making Sprint 97 happen. Sprint 98 will be a regular 2-week sprint. And so we will see you in exactly 2 weeks, November 7th. Thanks everyone.